All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Serious Angler Podcast and another real biology segment. Back with our favorite fisheries biologist, Mr. Stephen Bardin. And as always, I'm your host, Bailey Egbrett, and we're back with another jam-packed show where, as always, our main course, especially here at Real Biology, is teaching more about bass fishing and all the different intricacies that involve the bass fishing world. But Steve, another new episode of Real Biology today, and what can the folks look forward to, man?
And this is going to be a good one, but I'm going to have to start by asking the audience to be open minded, to listen to the entire episode, to think about this subject matter in a different way. We've got an excellent guest. He's going to cover something that's fairly controversial. We all have an opinion on it, but we all could learn a little bit as well. So I think I went and found the best person to teach this subject. And today we're going to talk about not just herbicide, but herbicide in aquatic plants and all kinds of different controls. It's a pretty deep episode. You're going to want maybe a dictionary. Troy hits some big words.
We
You
try
want a
to do our best
notepad.
to break them down.
Yep. Yep. It's a difficult subject. There's a lot. We're kind of all over the place because it's well, there's a lot to go over. So I just ask that everybody has an open mind, listen to the entire episode, and know that this is not the last time we'll have Troy on. We're gonna keep working with him to explore aquatic plants in depth.
Yeah, and with that, I guess I'll dumb it down even more from a subject title. Essentially, what we're getting at is spraying grass. Is for a lot of the
Yeah.
anglers that want that, or have heard the taboo line of spraying grass around the country. That's kind of what we're getting at here, and there's gonna be a lot more to come, like Steve mentioned. But
Although
this is
one of the
one.
first things you're gonna
I
hear.
gotta call myself out too. This is one where we talk about it in this with Troy. I've jumped to many a conclusion or thrown blame one way or another without understanding the entire process. Whether it's being done right or not is yet to be determined. But I think this is one. This is a great one to understand how it's done correctly and how it actually is important. So
Right.
I'm looking forward to this one. This is gonna be eye opening for me as well.
Yeah, the funny part is the first thing you're going to learn is we're not going to call it grass. So it's,
Yep,
it's
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, this is going to be a great episode. I can't wait to introduce everybody to Troy Goldsby. I love him. Hopefully you're going to love him too. I can't wait to see you in the comments too.
Heck yeah. Well, this is going to be a good one, folks. So let's get right into it with our new episode here at the Real Biology with Troy. All right, folks. We're back with another episode of Serious Anglers Real Biology. And Steve, what do we got? What do we got in store today, man?
Bailey, we promised Gary Klein in the first episode that we would stay out of controversy. And here we are. And we're gonna jump into controversy. I wanted to have the expert's expert on the subject of plant control. And there's only one guy in this country that I trust. He's actually a guy that, I text daily. I ask him for advice, not just about plants, but all aspects of my businesses. If I'm having trouble with a client or I have a interesting lake and I need help with it, this is who I call. So this is my expert. This is one of my best friends. Can't wait to introduce the world to Mr. Troy Goldsby.
Oh, thank you very much. That's a extremely kind intro, but it's a reciprocal feeling, buddy. I reach out to Stephen quite a lot on different projects that I'm working on. He's much more knowledgeable than I am. He tries to play that down, but I have, if I've got any knowledge at all, it's because I have listened to a lot of great biologists and botanists through the years, and have just retained a ton of that information and have tried to utilize it and kind of, I guess, landscape it into how we look at fisheries management and aquatic plant management. So, but there's 1,000 people that way smarter than me that have kind of dialed in what I do today. So,
Well, let's not be too humble, Troy. Let's start. Tell our audience, who you are, the company you built, maybe some of your great famous clients, and talk about a little bit of your lake management work before we get into the history of Troy Goldsby.
yeah, so the company Aqua Services was founded by my dad in 1982, incorporated in 1983. He was he's a master, he has a master's in botany from Northwestern Louisiana, was hired by the state of Florida in the early 70s to do enforcement and interdiction into invasive species coming into the country through the state of Florida. He was then hired by the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he brought the first airboat to the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1977. I was 3 months old, so I've literally been on an airboat since I was in diapers. Um, Built the business primarily on large scale aquatic plant control. That is still really the forte of what we do. That's the bulk of what we do. But then after my brother and I joined, specifically after I joined in '99, we decided we needed to go down the path of fisheries management. And I think it gave us a good bearing on both sides of that coin so that we could work on providing very high-end largemouth bass management, but also couple that with the aquatic plant knowledge that we had gained through not only the decades of my dad being in the industry, but also what we learned through the years also.
Yeah,
Oh,
awesome.
and the company name historically was Aqua Services Incorporated. We merged with a company called Jones Lake Management a couple of years ago. So now it's technically Aqua Services, a Jones Lake Management partner.
Yeah, yeah. And Troy, like you're saying, you actually grew up you grew up in Gunnersville, right? Like on Gunnersville Lake.
I grew up in Florence. So when my dad hired on, my mom and my dad moved to Florence, Alabama, which is where most of the research was being done for the TVA out of Muscle Shoals, Alabama, on Wilson Lake.
Hmm.
But they split up when I was pretty young. My dad moved to the eastern part of the state. I stayed in Florence with my mother, but grew up really, skiing and stomping around Wilson Lake. But then my dad built a big marina on Gunnersville, and so he lived on Gunnersville Lake, and we spent a ton of time not only skiing but fishing all over Gunnersville. And so my entire life was spent on the Tennessee River system.
Right.
And then when I moved into working for him, which I went through several career changes before I decided that was probably a pretty good gig. And yeah, man, it just felt good being on a boat every day on Gunnersville Lake. There's
Right.
days I got on an airboat for the first time in probably 3 years a couple of weeks ago and drove it. And man, there are days where I just wish I could click my phone off and just get back on an airboat because it's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
That's
So
cool.
early '90s. Oh, go ahead, Bailey.
Yeah, no, I was gonna ask like, because I'm sure there's some folks also wondering like getting into aquatic plants. That's pretty niche. Like, where did the passion come from it? But you kind of answered that, and it's kind of basically been family business since day one. Then.
Yeah, listen, I mean, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I had an uncle that was the kind of the head marine biologist for the state of Florida, and his zone was Apalachicola River down to Crystal River. And he was one of the first 5 permanent residents on St. George's Island. And so in the summers, I would spend time on St. George's Island. I thought that guy was the pimp of all pimps. I was like, I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to be a marine biologist when I grow up. And bet him $1,000 that I would make it all the way to a PhD marine biologist before I got out of school. And I owe him $1,000. I never I never finished a degree. So part of my work came out of my wife and I got married when we were both very young. I was working all over the place. I worked at a prison, worked for Coca-Cola, I worked for Lowe's, and I was like, man, I've been around that for a long time and it's a pretty good gig. So I might should go try that. And it really focused my path and focused what I was doing. And I fell in love with aquatic plant management, just fell in love with it. So
That's awesome.
not necessarily a marine biologist, but, and listen, I never graduated. I never received a degree in anything other than just life and, getting kicked around a little bit. So, yeah, that's how it
American
all kind
dream.
of got going. But yeah, my dad's gig started in Louisiana. He grew up. My whole family grew up in Louisiana, and he did his research on Black Lake, on drawdown effects, on different aquatic plants. One of those was hydrilla. So it was a pretty cool research project, and yeah, I mean, him starting a company led to the success that we have now.
That's awesome.
Before he had his company, talk about some of those stories, some of the things he was doing in the '70s, late '70s, really working to tune herbicide protocols and the research he was doing with TVA.
Yeah, so in 76, 77, TVA really beefed up their aquatic plant research program and hired some amazing people. There was a guy named Leon Bates who passed away this past year that was hiring. He hired a guy named Mike Dennis that was a PhD botanist. I actually met with Mike a couple of weeks ago on a project in Florida. He has a environmental consulting firm and has for years now. But Mike Dennis, my dad, Leon Bates, a guy named David Webb, who was kind of always the goat to me in terms of taxonomy and plant identification. He passed away last year also. But that research was really, focused on the best products for controlling individual plants at that time in the late 70s. The primary species of concern at that time was Eurasian water milfoil, Myriophyllum spicatum. They were doing research back then in the late 70s and very early 80s, even with fluordone. So what we know as, the big brand name is Sonar. But they were doing research back then. So it was really focused on how to control invasive exotics in the Tennessee River system. I think I don't know what actually led to my dad's departure, other than the fact that he wanted to start his own company, and the necessity to not have a conflicting interest there was pretty prevalent. So couldn't do both, and yeah, he had a lot of connections with folks with the Southern companies, Georgia Power, Alabama Power, people in Florida, and so he bought an airboat, and I think he had a Toyota Supra at the time, and he pulled an airboat around the southeast with a Toyota Supra, spraying weeds. So.
That's
It's
baller.
pretty awesome. Yeah, one time he ran out of fuel. Him and my uncle were driving down the highway, ran out of fuel in the Toyota Supra, and it was about a mile to the exit. And so they just pushed the Toyota Supra to the next exit with the airboat on the trailer.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's
But yeah,
So
that's kind of how all that began.
in that time, how many chemicals did they have that they could work with? Like how many active ingredients?
Oh, me, Stephen. I mean, I could count. There's always been copper. Copper's been around for, basically ever. 2,4-D has been around forever, which we had then. They were testing fluordone. They would have had diquat at that time. They would have had probably aquathol at that time. There may have been a few more at that time that are no longer labeled, but you can probably count on both hands the number, probably 6 or 7 true active ingredients. The past 10 to 15 years in the industry have really brought some
Mhm.
new technologies and new herbicides to the table that are really, really good. I couldn't give you the specific numbers, but I would say 6, 7, 8 active ingredients at the time.
Yeah,
So
and
very
that's kind of
limited, very limited.
the point I'm getting at is, Troy's dad had like, let's say 6 to 8 active ingredients. The plants are being introduced at that time. They're learning. Troy's dad is on the forefront of figuring out like what active ingredient actually controls a plant and at what rate. So whenever we talk about aquatic plant control today, we really are going to the source, Bailey. We're going to be able to dispel a lot of like the things that people think about aquatic plants that aren't correct. So I'm super excited about
Yeah,
this, Troy. So whenever
and listen,
like
when
on the
when we're talking about moving systems like that too, you got to imagine that even though there's probably 15 or 16 active ingredients now, you're still very, very limited in what actually works with a short contact time. So all of those things come into play with what we pick and choose for which products we're going to use for the right plants.
Well, let's start at a super high level, Troy. Let's talk about the difference between contact and systemic herbicides and how the mode of action actually works. Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, I mean, just it's pretty simple. If you're talking contact, it literally just comes in contact with the plant and it degrades the plant back to the sediments, right? It would be kind of like, if you're just going to equate it to something, it'd be like dropping some salt or maybe gasoline on a grassy area in your yard. It just burns it back to the sediments. It does not work on the subterranean structures. It doesn't work on any root structure or tuber. It's not a pre-emergent. And then systemic is what it says. It works through the entire system of the plant. Comes in contact with the plant. It's translocated into the root system, and it kills the plant from top to bottom, subterranean into the root system. And so it gives you longevity of control over short-term contact control, which typically allows the plant to return in, let's say, 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the species and where it's located.
Hmm.
All right. So first thing we got to know is contact versus systemic herbicides. And then Troy, what are some of the things that we think about whenever we're going to select a herbicide? So we know that we can go those two control methods, but how do you actually put together a protocol?
First and foremost is which plant is it? Like, got to know the species. I get very frustrated when people just, say, oh, you can use X product and they don't know what the plant is. It's very frustrating to me. It's poor science. It's definitely not even close to coming to best management practices. Identification is crucial. Then that allows you to go, all right, we know we have this number of products, contact and or systemic, that work on that plant specifically. And then we start looking at the environment. We look at size of the water body, depth of the water body, biovolume of vegetation in the water body. How deep is it? Has it reached the surface? Is it a moving system? Is it a stagnant system? Are we trying to control the entire amount, or do we have 1 or 2 acres that we need to carve out in a large moving system? And then that really starts honing in which products you can use. And when we talk about moving systems, we really, really have to look at contact herbicides. You need, something in the neighborhood of maybe 4 to 8 hours of contact for those products to work. And they work well when you get the contact, but you've just got to really dial in based on environment, what that moving water looks like, what that system looks like. So we start with speciation, pick the products that are available for that species, and then move to environment and really start driving down which products will work in that system.
Yeah. So it gets complicated quick. It sounds like. Can you give us some of like the most challenging plants that you're trying to control? Or maybe the better part of this would be, what if we just start in the early 90s and we talk about Gunnersville specifically? Like whenever you show up and you're going to start working for your dad, what plants were present that you guys were actually trying to control?
So the driving factor on the Tennessee River system, I'll just give you the brief history of
Yep.
aquatic plants on the Tennessee River system. Back in the 50s, maybe early 60s, milfoil was the first species that Eurasian water milfoil, Myriophyllum spicatum. Now there's, you know, 30 different species of milfoil we can talk about, but specifically Myriophyllum spicatum. And the first instance of that was a lady that dumped her aquarium in, I believe, Watts Bar, which is, you got Gunnersville, Nickajack, Chickamauga, then Watts Bar. So that was the first instance. But then once milfoil became established, it became established rapidly and pretty rampantly. And at that time, there was not a true to form aquatic plant control program. So all the aquatic plant control that was being done was born out of their vector control program, their mosquito control program. There was a big push to control malaria throughout the world. So out of that, they really tried to look at eradication efforts for milfoil back in the 60s and 70s. Figured out pretty quick eradication was not something we can accomplish. Mother Nature is much better at that than not. Mother Nature's not great at eradication, but she's much better at large scale control than what we are. So the 70s rock along, they're doing management and maintenance of milfoil on the entire system. Gunnersville, Nickajack, Chickamauga, the entire system. But Gunnersville was a focal point, and it always has been, because it's a very, very shallow lake. Average depth, I think, is maybe 9, 10 feet, which means it's basically one big littoral shelf. Vegetation is going to grow anywhere you put it for the most part. So then in about 82, hydrilla became established. Um, Hydrilla dominated the milfoil, and it was the dioecious version of the hydrilla. There's two biotypes, two strands of hydrilla. There's a dioecious and a monoecious. The dioecious was the problem for many years. There was an attempt with grass carp to control on Gunnersville primarily the hydrilla. Those fish were bought in the mid to late 80s. And then we had a series of these very, very high spring rainfall events in the late 80s up until about 1990. So the grass carp had already been purchased. They were put into the river system. We had these high spring rainfalls, and vegetation bottomed out completely in about 90, 91, like across the river system and across the southeast, to be honest. It wasn't just a Gunnersville phenomenon. The grass carp got a bad rap on that because the timing of it looked like grass carp went in, vegetation crashed. And that wasn't necessarily what happened. They certainly added to it. But the high spring rainfalls, like I was talking about, Mother Nature really, really thwarted the growth and controlled it for a few years. Then by about 95, 96, 97, hydrilla had really ramped back up to, very high levels, 25, 26,000 acres on Gunnersville alone, which is, you're over 30% at that point of the entire reservoir, which becomes an issue for all of the reasons that the reservoir was created, and to be honest, for fishing as well. So a stakeholders group was put together, a really, really great stakeholders group. It was kind of a model for the country at the time. They contracted with Aqua Services, my dad's company, in '98, I believe, for the first time. Rocked along there, controlling hydrilla and milfoil, just primarily exotic species in very, very tight areas. The control efforts that are done there and on most large scale reservoirs like this are access areas, docks, marinas, boat ramps, swimming areas. There's no large scale efforts to control large open areas of aquatic vegetation in any of these scenarios, whether it's on the Tennessee River system or if you're looking at, Lake Gaston or wherever you're looking, those efforts just aren't, they're really not focused that way. Um, there's some lakes where hydrilla is truly, the eradication efforts are truly there and they do a pretty good job at it. That's not the case on the Tennessee River system. Um, So the two primary species for many years primarily was hydrilla, along with some milfoil in the spring. Dioecious hydrilla got replaced by monoecious hydrilla, which had a different growth pattern in kind of the 2010, 2011 timeframe. That left a bare bottom in the winter months, a very sandy bottom. Instead of leaving almost a carpet on the bottom, the monoecious hydrilla went away in the winter, left a sandy bottom. And that opened it up in about 2016 for a hybridized exotic um, Vallisneria. It's called Vallis, it's a hybridized species from South America, Southeast Asia and South Africa, Vallisneria spiralis and Vallisneria densesserellata. It was hybridized for the aquarium trade. That got into the system. We thought we had the best thing that had ever existed. We always thought that Vallisneria americana was kind of the end all be all for fisheries. And if we ever had it on Gunnersville, that everybody would be happy. Well, it wasn't Vallisneria americana. And in terms of control, it has been the most expensive and toughest vegetation to control that we've seen on the system in my 26 years of doing this. Yeah. So
Man,
that's
that's
kind of the
a lot.
that's the broad
Yeah, a lot
history.
to unpack there, Troy. First, I want to tell the audience Vallisneria americana is your American eelgrass. So we're talking about eelgrass in these later stages of Gunnersville. But I want to go back to the beginning. You said the words littoral shelf, and that's going to be our scientific word of the day, littoral shelf. So you want to describe what a littoral shelf is for us?
Yeah, so there's basically two types of zones in a lake. There's the littoral zone, which is your shallow shelf area. So in the southeast, I kind of look at that from, really and truly kind of 0 to 15 feet deep. Um, some people argue with those depths. Once you get out past that and you get into deep water, 20 plus feet, 15 plus feet, it's called the pelagic zone. And that's where primarily your crappie and your stripe and your shad and your deeper water fish live. The littoral zone is what is occupied by our shallow fish, largemouth bass and bluegill primarily. Um, Smallmouth, for example, are considered really a deep water pelagic fish. But largemouth and bluegill are a littoral zone fish. And because of that shallow water in a littoral zone, vegetation can grow rampantly with ease. Native and exotic species can grow rampantly. So,
Right.
and in the southeast, there's not many reservoirs that are built that take into consideration whether or not they're going to be primarily a littoral zone lake or if they're going to be a pelagic deep water lake. Most of them have vast areas of littoral shelf, which is indicative of extreme vegetation growth.
Yeah, and for our audience, whenever I was a professor, I would teach our students that the littoral zone is where sunlight literally hits the bottom, the sediment. So then that's where plants can actively grow. Um, so when a plant is introduced into a system, and Troy said the first thing he wants to do is identify what species it is, and then really knowing how much littoral shelf you have or that littoral zone you have starts to tell you, depending on that plant, how concerned you need to be about it becoming invasive. Because as Troy mentioned just then, it doesn't matter if it's a native or non-native species. Any plant growing in a system that is the wrong system for it, it can be fairly invasive, especially with a lot of littoral shelf and clear water and some of those things. So as you're moving through that story, Troy, you started talking about the monoecious and dioecious hydrilla, and I think that it would be good for audience just to talk about growth patterns of plants. Period. This is really the first aquatic plant episode we've ever had. So, we put plants into some categories based on how they grow, and then each within that category, there's different plants. So, do you want to talk? Let's talk specifically about hydrilla first, and to describe that plant and how it grows.
Yeah, so most aquatic plants, all aquatic plants really, especially, so there's three types of aquatic plants. There's submerged, which means it grows fully under the surface. There's emergent, which means it grows from the bottom but then sticks out of the surface of the water. So you're looking at rushes. Well, there's actually four. So there's submerged, there is emergent, there's floating leaf, which would be lilies. Some people would even consider like a American pondweed, Potamogeton nodosus, a floating leaf. And then there's true floating plants. That's your Salvinia molesta, giant Salvinia, that's hyacinths, that's water lettuce, Pistia stratiotus. Um, so those are kind of the four species, or the four types of growth patterns. Hydrilla is a completely submerged species that is an exotic species. And hydrilla has what we call a low CO2 compensation point, which simply means it can grow at much lower light levels than our native species. That's why it becomes such a dominant species. The two growth forms or the two biotypes, dioecious means two house. So basically, the reproductive structures are on different plants. And then there's monoecious, which means one house. And so both reproductive structures are on a single plant. The difference in growth patterns is kind of odd. Hydrilla is a much, much more robust looking plant. It's very healthy looking. It's very lush. That's the dioecious. The monoecious biotype, it's more spindly looking. They set down their tubers or turions, whatever you want to call it, at different times of the year. And in the winter months, like I was saying, dioecious would typically leave a carpet on the bottom that kind of protected the bottom from other species becoming an issue. When the monoecious became established, it kind of left a sandy bottom, which opened up for other species in the early spring to become established and become problematic.
All right, so identify the plant, figure out the littoral shelf, look at how's it going to grow, what category of plant is it in. Then you start selecting a herbicide, and you already give us a lot of information about what you're going to do to select a herbicide. So now, can you talk about how herbicides work and what happens to them in the water?
On a high level, yes. I mean,
Yeah, on a
I
very
probably
high
should have.
level. Yeah.
You probably should have had a chemist on for all of that. So it's
No, I need a Troy explanation of what's going on.
yeah. So look, when we talk about herbicides, for the most part, contact herbicides have modes of action. When we talk about herbicides, it's the mode of action. That's how does it enter the plant, and what physiological processes does it affect within the plant. Contact herbicides have a very broad mode of action. So if they come in contact with the plant, that mode of action is not as specific as systemic herbicides, and so it will work on a variety of plants. But it works rapidly. So we know that when we're using contact herbicides, we can have short contact time, maximum control for a flowing system. When we look at systemic herbicides, you start looking at herbicides that affect specific physiological processes in plants and plants alone. And keep in mind, when we talk about even contact herbicides, they only affect plants. They don't kill insects, they don't kill fish. There's no mode of action for anything other than plants. And then when we dial it into some of these products, they're affecting specific receptors. They're affecting how a plant actually photosynthesizes. Like fluordone, for example, stops the photosynthesis process. We don't photosynthesize. There are specific physiological processes that are targeted by these systemic herbicides that allow them to be very, very specific and used at extremely low rates. And so they enter a plant, they affect a specific physiological process, sometimes in just certain plants, and control those. It takes a long time, though, for those products to work. So you have to have a lot of contact time. That's why they don't necessarily work in flowing systems all the time.
Right.
I'll give you an example. There's one that's called Priscillacor. Fluoroperoxif Fluoroperoxyfen benzyl is the active ingredient. Um, it is an unbelievable product on milfoil. It works in parts per billion, extremely low rates, and we can get in flowing systems. And it's a systemic herbicide. This is what's really cool about it. It works on other plants, but it has to have a longer contact time. If we can get like 30 minutes of contact in a moving system with Priscillacor, we can eliminate Eurasian water milfoil or parrot's feather or hybrid milfoils up north. We have and there's specific modes of action, specific processes that it works on in that plant. So it's a great, great product when we're talking about multiple species, but primarily when I use it, it's for milfoil species. So there's no physiological process in humans that these herbicides work on. They are targeted for physiological processes inside of plants, and that's how they work.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, if you read the label kind of tells you a story of every single herbicide. Labels are easy to find too on the internet if you actually want to learn specifically about what it does, how long it's active in the water. But you read the label on some of these contact herbicides, and the re-entry period is like as soon as the application is over. Um, you know,
There's no there's no product in the eastern United States that has any water use restrictions. All right, let me rephrase that. There are some products that have some irrigation restrictions. For example,
right?
if I treat an area with 2,4-D, you would not want to irrigate tomatoes out of that area for probably, I would say it's probably 3 days. However, there's no swimming restrictions. Um, there's no potable drinking water. There are some potable drinking water restrictions, but you'd basically have to be right on top of the drinking water plant. There are step back restrictions. There's no swimming restrictions. There's no fish consumption restrictions. There's no fishing restrictions. So the only reason we want people to get out of the water is so we don't run over them. I mean, that's basically it. So uh, we don't want to play whack-a-mole out there with our airboats.
Oh,
So
yeah, I bet. I bet.
the restrictions are really, and listen, what's really unique about it, there's a specific product known as Aquathol K. When I was a kid, it was made by a company called Penwalt, I believe. And I remember as a kid, even with 2,4-D, we had swimming restrictions. There were some fish consumption restrictions, and all of these products are reviewed periodically by the EPA again and again and again and again. I think it's probably every 5 years. Uh, every time these products are re-registered, the restrictions become less and less and less because we know so much more about them, and our ability to test them is so much better today. So where there at one point was a fish consumption restriction with some of these products, those went away years ago, and we just start seeing these restrictions getting lesser and lesser and lesser based on our ability to understand them better and also test them better.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then a lot of them photodegrade, so just the sunlight alone neutralizes the herbicide.
Yeah, photo degradation's rapid. Dilution is high. Biofate, their fate in the environment they decompose and break down rapidly. Sediments help to decompose them or break them down. Sunlight does, and it's a pretty rapid process. We're talking several hours to a couple of days.
Yeah. So Troy, I keep hearing, and I'm gonna put you on the spot. That's you know me. I keep hearing you talking about the herbicides and how you're selecting them and how you're using them and how safe it is. Why do they have such a bad rep? Why do anglers just dislike herbicide?
I mean, look, uh, the unknown, maybe. I don't know. I think that Look, I think we're all guilty of some things in life. You hear something once and you're like, oh, that might be true. You hear it twice from somebody you trust. Oh, you're like, oh, well, that sounds legitimate. You hear it 3 or 4 times and all of a sudden it becomes the gospel almost.
Right.
I think that through the years, that misinformation is probably our biggest adversary. And look, there's things that I do this with in my life, most likely. I think everybody does. So I think misinformation and then straight up disinformation at times. The
Hmm.
misinformation is something that can be dealt with, but when you have people that are truly trying to disinform a group of people, it's problematic. And there's folks out there on both sides. I mean, we can't just We can't just call, this a one-sided argument. What we try to do is really cut through misinformation, and there's several organizations out there we do that with. Because look, if I'm talking to a group of people, even talking on this podcast right now,
Mm-hmm.
everybody's going to think I'm biased. And am I biased in some ways? Yeah, most likely. Do I like what I do for a living? Yeah, so I'm biased towards it. But I do try to be extremely set aside. I try to take a different view of it, and I really try to look at what the best thing is for every environment, for every system, and really approach it that way. And herbicides, look, herbicides just have a bad rap. I mean, we see the glyphosate issue. By the way, glyphosate's not going away. I mean, there was a huge lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably unfounded. There was lots of money lost, lots of money spent, and it gets a bad rap. Anytime, though, a product is misused, um, it can be harmful. I
Right.
encourage most of the time when this conversation comes up, I encourage most people to go just look under their kitchen sink, pull out any product underneath there, and read the warning labels.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what's amazing about it is the majority of those products are actually focused on controlling organisms that are more like us than they are plants.
Mm-hmm.
Clorox, I mean, Dawn dish detergent. It's and when people say that they are anti anything that is um, a herbicide or antibiotic or anything, if it kills anything, they're against it. Well, I
Right.
mean, the first thing people do in the morning when they wake up is they wash their hands with hand soap to clean their hands off. Well, you've used a bactericide. I mean, you're using these things on a daily basis. So I think sometimes it's just about perspective. I do think misinformation is a problem. I think disinformation is a problem. I think
Well,
everybody coming, and I think everybody coming out of their corners and having conversations like this one is the only way to approach this topic, or really any controversial topic.
yeah, and I always point out we can all find an example of a situation where even a herbicide was used and then a fish kill happened down the road. I can point to those things where I've applied herbicide in certain situations in private lakes and I've caused a fish kill. But that sentence structure just said I caused the fish kill, not the herbicide caused the fish kill, because it
That's
was
right.
something that I didn't calculate correctly, either in the application dose or timing or whatever it might have been. And, I have to take ownership of that. And most often, it has nothing to do with the herbicide. Most often, always, it has nothing to do with the herbicide. It's the dose you're putting in, it's how you're applying it, some variable you didn't account for, or a weather pattern change that you couldn't control that followed it. We look at several reservoirs. I mean, our anglers are going through Florida right now fishing, and we always hear things about Florida. And I got a call from one of the MLF anglers early this week about there's a fish kill going on in one of the lakes that they potentially could fish in the competition. And they asked me when was the last time they sprayed, as if like that was the what was happening. And of course, Florida had just done an application 2 weeks before, so that angler automatically assumed that herbicide caused that fish kill. And I started talking them through it, about how plants decompose, how water quality changes, how the weather conditions in Florida, got up into the upper 80s, and that probably caused some oxygen issues. And you add all those things together, and situationally, it did cause an issue that, perspective wise, the angler thought was due to the herbicide. And I think that's a lot of it. We see a lot of those
Yeah.
situations where they put those puzzle pieces together and they jump to that conclusion.
I
Yeah.
think
And
us
listen,
as anglers too need a like when there's something like that happens, like a fish kill, or say historically an area that has grass doesn't have grass anymore. We need, and I'm calling myself on this too, because I've been part of the one that I need to jump to some sort of cause and effect. There needs to be a reason behind something happening, whereas it could just be Mother Nature. And like you talked about, Steve, like weather, where it's, if a famous grass flat on a lake is gone, and we learned that they have sprayed at one point, anglers instinctually, I think, are going to jump to, it's because they're spraying, it's killing everything. So I think some anglers in nature need something to blame, whether that is herbicide or not. I think that's a big root cause of it too. Just, I guess, human nature and part of it. But
I don't think that's necessary. And look, that's not necessarily angler nature. That's human nature, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when something happens and we don't understand what happened, we look for the causative effect. I mean, we've got to know what caused that. I mean, that's just that's what humans do. To Stephen's point, and Bailey, I'll get you to yours too. To Stephen's point, it is always our fault. Now, there are some fish species, trout, for example, and threadfin shad are highly susceptible to copper-based products. So if we know trout are present, we're not going to use copper-based products. Threadfin shad are only really susceptible to copper if the alkalinity is low. So if we haven't done our job and checked the alkalinity and we kill shad, again, we could have fixed that through a water quality scenario. Um, but in terms of, you know, a toxicity issue, it's just a very, very rare case. What typically happens is somebody controls in private impoundments. We'll talk about large impoundments. In private impoundments, typically somebody's controlled too much vegetation at once. They've caused an oxygen sag through a very rapid decomposition process, and that lack of oxygen kills the fish. Or they didn't control too much. They controlled the right amount that they wanted to for that day. A weathering pattern sets up, and there's still a massive amount of vegetation. And just so everybody knows, vegetation doesn't only produce oxygen, it also respires and takes in oxygen. So when you get a very dense cove or full of vegetation, or a small impoundment full of vegetation, and you get a lot of hot, cloudy days followed by a very, very hot, cloudy night, you lose all of the oxygen in that either section of a water body or in that impoundment, and you lose way more fish than what's ever caused by any type of problem that a person has created with herbicides. And then, you know, just back to this thing about what Bailey said about, you know, wanting to blame something. Typically, again, I go back to Mother Nature being the biggest driver of what we see in all of these environments. You can't spray something on one side of Okeechobee and be on the very opposite western side, you know, 5 days later, and there's a vegetation gone that you thought was supposed to be there, and blame that on something that happened 20 miles away. No herbicide works that way. I don't care if we're talking terrestrial or aquatic. If you dilute your 2,4-D or your whatever you're spraying on your fence row, if you dilute it too much with too much water, it's not going to kill anything. So if you're going to spray a fence row and you have too much water in that backpack sprayer in your ATV sprayer, go down that fence row, it won't die. It's too dilute. And so these products, they have to stay concentrated in a submerged application in a very, very tight area for a very short amount of time. Once they move, and I like to tell people, I don't like to claim that we're cookie cutters in what we do, but we're pretty close. When we treat around docks, you can specifically see that we've treated around docks and we don't kill anything outside of those perimeters. And when you look at it from an aerial view, it is plain as day. It is cut out nearly perfectly. So, and then when you're doing handgun applications, emergent applications with a wand, again, you're not going to spray hyacinths on the east side of Okeechobee and have dead hyacinths on the west side of Okeechobee. It doesn't happen. It's just not how they work. So, I get the need for everybody to find the causative reason when there's a fish kill, but most of the time, I would say literally 99.5% of the time, there is a cause other than the herbicide applications that have been done.
Yeah. So, Troy, how do we do a better job as an industry? How do we change this perception? How do we get to a place where people know how to ID plants, understand control methods, and feel comfortable with this is going to make the environment better for them as an angler, or them for recreation or navigation or whatever it is?
I think the first thing is we have to use podcasts like this. We have to use organizations that we have, whether that's out of the American Fisheries Society, whether that's North American Lake Management Society, the Aquatic Plant Management Society, AERF, the Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration Foundation, is a great advocate for aquatic ecosystems in general. So I think using those outreach programs is very important. Podcasts like this, and I also think for the angling community, dispelling, I think, myths that revolve around fisheries being better because of aquatic plants. look, I love plants. I love what they do for a fishery, but we've got to get past this point. I had a huge argument with a guy on Facebook the other day. You think I would learn by now not to have Facebook arguments, but they kind of piss me off, and I go down a rabbit hole. Um, you know, too much vegetation is a problem for a healthy to create a healthy fishery. Do plants create catchability? Yes. Do they necessarily help a fishery? No. So that's not to say that in a perfect world, if you could maintain an area of vegetation, yes, it's the best possible thing you can have for improving habitat within a fishery. Just doesn't always work that way. You get to 10%, you're like, oh, this is great. You get to 15%, you're like, this is still great. You get to 25%, and you're like, this is getting a little bit different. And then all of a sudden, you're at 40%, and there's no turning back, and the fishery
Hmm.
starts to degrade fairly rapidly. So I think it's important to not only approach this from an aquatic plant management standpoint and how effective and efficient and safe it is, because it's very, very safe. We
Do,
have to approach it from a fisheries biology standpoint too.
does this conversation change if we're talking about one plant versus multiple plants in the same area?
A polyculture of plants instead of a monoculture.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on. I mean, again, speciation is important, and it depends on the reservoir. But in shallow water systems, not really. I mean, you can have multiple plants growing in the same area and still have a density that is too high to be a great fishery. You're going to get great edge effect for catching fish in the summer months, but you're going to have dense mats of vegetation that are very difficult to pull fish out of for several reasons, but primarily because they just don't like to be in hot, dense, matted vegetation areas. It's not, and look, they can effectively hunt inside of those mats. So,
That's right. Yeah.
uh, and look, there's been extensive studies done on this. Steve Salmons, professor at Auburn, did some research back in the day with Jeff Slipke and Mike Messina on Spring Creek and Lake Seminole. I mean, the fishery didn't decline when they eliminated the vegetation. The fish just started occupying a different part of the water column.
Right.
Um, Fishing strategies had to change, but the fishery actually improved after the control of the hydrilla in the Spring Creek arm of Lake Seminole. So,
That's good. That's good for anglers to know too, because a lot of times we get asked, Bailey, you've asked me similar questions. Like after they spray, what happens? Where do the fish go? What do they do? And I always tell anglers, that first 2 weeks after the herbicide has been applied and the plant is actively dying, the water quality may degrade to the point that the fish want to move out in search for a better oxygen, whatever it might be. But they'll transition to the first habitat type that they can outside of that area. They'll hold, and then as water quality improves, they're going to move right back into that same area. They're just going to occupy a different part of the water column or a different type of habitat.
yeah,
They're
they
not going
moved
to
to
change their
woody
home
structure.
range.
No, they stay in that home range. That's exactly right. They moved to stumpy, woody structure, tree tops, whatever it might be. And look, I'm not saying that that's when I look at habitat, we've talked about this, Stephen. I look at habitat as dense habitat and spatial habitat. Dense habitat protects young of the year fish. It allows small fish to get to a size that is very beneficial for bass to consume. If that's not present, then you wind up with um, productivity that isn't and growth that isn't what it should be. So the necessity for vegetation is obviously there, or dense habitat, something that comes close to mimicking vegetation. And then when we talk about spatial habitats, stumps, treetops, rock piles, those are all good attraction points and ambush points, but they don't make up for not having dense habitat. So I don't want people to misconstrue what I'm saying about this. Vegetation is necessary and important, but we don't design lakes well enough to house native species, even native species or exotic species, to a point that they don't become problematic. They become problematic, they become invasive. And when I look at a reservoir, I look at the original reason the reservoir was created. So if we're talking about, let's just use Wilson Lake, for example, on the Tennessee River system, or the entire Tennessee River system. It was hydroelectric generation, it was navigation, it was flood storage. Those are the three big reasons those are there. And anything that impedes those three primary objectives, to me, is a detriment to that system. But I approach every system. If it's a 20-acre impoundment, I approach it that way. What does the client want out of it? And where we can be selfish in the private industry is that we can go into a 20-acre lake, we can have it completely void of vegetation, but we can pack it full of non-growing, artificial, spatial, and dense habitat. And we can recreate what everybody loves about vegetation without it becoming a problem. And so we get to be a little bit hypocritical on this because, we have the ability in these smaller impoundments to really change those without utilizing vegetation. Very hard not to have vegetation, a good fishery without dense habitat in large water bodies, and you need vegetation to do that. But it's about how do you maintain it at a level that isn't a detriment to the reservoir in general, and then ultimately to the fishery over time. And those are the big questions that we have to answer. And it's tough. There's not an easy solution out there. But I think it's worth everybody just understanding that this is not a harmful process. You're never going to convince some people of that. It's not a harmful process. We can be very plant specific if we need to. We can leave natives and control exotics with different herbicides if we need to. And we can improve fisheries if we have the right control methods and attitude about how we approach those scenarios.
Well, I think if everybody knew it was somebody like you, Troy, that we can tell you're passionate about it, you love it, you want the fishery to do well. That's part of the gig. But you started out. Let's identify the plant. Let's figure out the littoral zone. Let's select the right herbicide for the right situation. If everybody knew they had a Troy as the applicator, I think more people would get behind it. But instead, we hear so many anglers talk about using things like harvesters or alternate control methods. So, while we have you, let's chat a little bit about let's chat about not herbicide. Let's chat about what are the other control methods and what are the benefits and detriments of those as well.
So the first one, what I would, all right. So there's several. There's mechanical, there's biological, there's physical control methods. So when we talk
Yep.
about physical control methods, that would be the start for me. It's if you're building a private impoundment, design it right so you can have littoral shelves and you can have vegetation if you're passionate about vegetation. So physical and/or cultural control is what you would look at first. Obviously, we've discussed herbicides at length. Biological, there's really only, I mean, look, there's some flea beetles that control alligator weed. There's a hydrilla fly that can control hydrilla. The problem is that a lot of the herbicide, a lot of the vegetation has adapted to cold temperatures in areas where the biological control hasn't adapted to those cold temperatures yet. So the flea beetle, the hydrilla fly, they can't survive some of these colder winters where the vegetation actually can. There's grass carp. I personally, in private impoundments, do not like them. I know the need for them in large impoundments. The drawback to grass carp is that they're non-selective, so that if you're targeting hydrilla and the hydrilla's all gone, they're going to eat something. So, but over the years, we've dialed in the stocking rates of grass carp to be much lower stocking rates with additions every couple of 3 years, so that they really stay targeted on that exotic species that you're wanting to control. Um, Mechanical. Well, there's also physical barriers you can put down. There's what's called a benthic mat that you lay on the bottom of the lake. Uh, Horribly cost prohibitive. And the problem with when we start talking about these types of physical slash mechanical control methods, um, if you cover the bottom of a lake, a benthic mat, you're covering everything that lives in the benthos. Every flora and fauna that was living under that mat no longer lives under that mat. It's going to die. You're suffocating the entire bottom. And within about 3 or 4 months, all you need for hydrilla to grow, or some of these exotic species, is the tiniest amount of sediment. We see hydrilla growing in the cracks that are in boat ramps, the designed cracks, the little expansion joints that are in boat ramps. The sediment that gathers in those will grow some of these exotic plants. So benthic mats, while they seem environmentally friendly, to me are they're more of a detriment than what they're worth because they're killing everything under that mat. And then when we talk about harvesting, I mean mechanical harvesting, again, most plants, specifically exotic plants, grow through a seed and or a tuber system, and they also grow through fragmentation. And hydrilla specifically, since that's kind of become the one we're talking about, has what's called adventitious shoot growth. So when you cut hydrilla, hold on, somebody's daggone buzzing me at too late in the evening. When you cut hydrilla, if you don't pick up every fragment, then you're spreading those fragments to a new growth location. And when it grows back, when it starts from that shoot that you've cut, it's like cutting back a crepe myrtle. From that cut point, it comes back in a bunch, and so you've actually create more growth by cutting it. That's called adventitious shoot growth. So it actually increases the rate of growth. And then also when we talk about harvesting or mulching, if there's fish living inside of those mats, I mean, you're gathering fish, you're collecting fish, you're cutting fish. So again, to me, and look, everybody's gonna say, "Oh, it's Troy talking about herbicides." Those are, I mean, you can use dyes that help to reflect light back out. If you're in a private impoundment, you can certainly do that. Um, it can be effective. It's not great. I like colorants, but I mean, it almost has to look like Mr. Clean came and put stuff in your toilet to get it dark enough to control vegetation. Um, for me, herbicides again are very selective. They have specific modes of action that only affect plants, and when utilized by the label and used properly and applied properly, which is what most people in the industry do, they're only affecting the plant. If there's organisms living inside those mats of vegetation, they have the ability to disperse and get out of the way. They don't even have to. They can sit there. The herbicide's not going to do anything to them. But this is why herbicides become the most cost-effective, the most efficient, and the most biologically sound way to control plants. There's no question. There's just nothing else that can replace them. So, did that help with the types of control?
That was perfect, Troy. You covered I have this whole list that we've made, things I want to make sure I cover, and you're knocking them off. This is exactly why I wanted you on the show.
Yeah.
I think that was a great depiction of it too. And I think a message that was in there, I think for folks like myself, that are listening to this, that for a long time have been like very anti-chemical, because you think, oh, more grass the better, right? In a lake, where the thing that you mentioned, and I didn't want to cut you off and going back to it, but how too much grass can actually be an issue for a fishery. And so there's a need for this. It's just people like yourself that can do it correctly. That is the importance, and that's the message we need to get across. That's
And listen, I can sit here. I can list 20 companies that do what we do across the country, and they all do it the right way. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to tell you that there's not people out there and companies that try to skirt by and do things the wrong way. Obviously, there is. There is in every industry. And look, I hate it. It hurts us. Anybody that is a dog on our industry is a problem for me. Because all we try to do is make sure we're educating the proper way. We're providing the proper control methods. We're doing it the right way, following all the laws, following the environmental science of the day. And when one person does it wrong, it's a problem. But we can start naming companies in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, Louisiana. We can run the gambit. And the majority of the people out there are trying to do this the right way. Again, I think everybody gets in these corners and they fight from the corners, and they're just yelling across they're yelling across the ring, and nothing ever gets done. It takes, so what I do now, this is my approach to naysayers. I've had a couple in the past that we've threatened lawsuits against for defamation and stuff like that. But the last one I did, the guy was pretty adamant that we were just doing this great amount of harm, and I said, listen, and it was a Pickwick Lake guy. I said, listen, you get as many anglers as you want. Let's go to Pickwick Landing State Park. Let's have a conversation about vegetation. And the first thing I do is what I did today. I said, we're going to talk about species. If you ask me how we control grass, probably not going to talk about it. because grass is not something that we're out there controlling. We need to understand species, how we do it, what we're doing, and why it's not affecting the rest of the vegetation in the reservoir. 100 people came as naysayers and 98 left maybe not completely agreeing, but at least understanding that we are not out there just willy-nilly spraying everything that we see and controlling all of the vegetation in a reservoir. That's not the goal. It never has been the goal. I mean, that is not the goal on these reservoir systems that we're working on. Do I take that approach of eradication and private impoundments? Yes, because again, I can be selfish and I can replace that vegetation with something else. That is not the goal in large main stem reservoirs anywhere. With some caveats, everybody has to understand what's called FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So when a dam is built on a large system, that FERC license is in place, and there are certain parameters that have to be abided by within that. And one of those is controlling and eliminating at all cost exotic invasive species that do harm to that system or to that dam system. So there are reservoirs where eradication attempts are taken on exotic invasive species. However, that is not the case on the native species. I can give you example after example in North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, where native species are off limits based on the shoreline control program, shoreline management program. So even Vallisneria neotropicalis, which is really native to Florida, but has moved into North Carolina and Georgia and some of the other areas, where I would think that it's really an exotic species in those areas because it's moved out of Florida, they see it as a native and it is off limits. So, it's one of those things where exotic species oftentimes are targeted and they try to make sure they're eradicated completely. Native species are left alone unless they're impeding navigation and or docks. But there's no large scale efforts to control all of the vegetation on every reservoir anywhere. That's just not happening.
Well, Troy, you said something that I think we have to dive into and explain a little bit, because I think a lot of anglers don't understand what a controlling authority is, who owns the reservoir, what the process is, and how their state fish and wildlife agency may not even be playing a role in this at all. So if you can, give us a little idea of, like, specifically for your contracts, for the project you're working on, who's hiring you, and what is the purpose, and then how does the system work? Like, who owns it?
So look, anything that's navigable waters is obviously there. The Corps of Engineers has some authority there, and every system can be a little bit different. The dam licensing and the FERC regulations fall to whatever entity has created that river, that reservoir system.
So that could be like Georgia
So
Power, Alabama
Alabama
Power.
Power, Duke Energy, the Tennessee Valley Authority, they have the regulatory authority over what gets controlled in terms of species in those systems. And then every state agency, for the most part, the game and fish agencies in every state works in coordination with those entities to make sure that fisheries are operating properly, that vegetation and different types of invasive mollusks may not be a problem. But also, these entities have their own biological groups within the companies too. TVA has a biological group. Southern Company, Georgia Power, Alabama Power have their own group. Duke Energy obviously has a great fisheries group. So they're all looking at and assessing that as well. And then there are shoreline management plans that are put in place by states and by these entities as well that describe how you can control or not control certain species. So there's really three agencies that come into play when navigation is affected. The Corps of Engineers is always a part of that. And then there's the actual controlling entity, the reason that the systems are there, whether it be Georgia Power, Alabama Power, Duke, Progress, whoever it is, TVA. And then there are the state agencies that help with stocking different species and monitoring those species as well.
So really, any of those three could be contacting your company or putting a bid out that you would bid on.
That's right. Typically, so some of the reservoirs that are really kind of the Tom Bigby, for example, Tom Bigby Waterway comes out of Pickwick But it's truly controlled by the Corps of Engineers. So that would, if there's a contract out there, that would be the Corps. Um, if it's the Coosa chain of rivers in Alabama, that's going to be an Alabama Power scenario. Lake Norman is really a Duke Energy type of scenario. But yeah, the controlling entities that built the reservoir systems are the ones that typically provide the contracts. And it's not like they're just going, "Hey, y'all go spray." I mean, it's a very,
Correct.
very logistically, it's a very tight knit group of people that work together from the contracting entity to the contractor to understand species, again, areas of impact, best control methods. Whether that's harvesting, whether that's herbicides, there's a very, very tight unit of people that
Hmm.
work to make sure that's all being fulfilled at the highest level possible.
So you
And
basically
look,
get. Go ahead, Troy. Sorry.
no, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say you basically get for just the audience to understand, like a map of the reservoir that says this is your control area and this is your target species, and here's the list of herbicides that we allow, and then you build your protocol based on your experience and that
It even
those
goes
kind of.
beyond that. So
Okay.
it goes beyond that. The majority of the time, the contracting entity will provide mapping and herbicide, not recommendations, but requirements for what's going to be utilized within that certain polygon. So we don't even typically, we may have input on that. We may say, "Hey, this is probably best for that." And then they go, "All right, well, we're going to use that product." But they're truly controlling what is sprayed, when it's sprayed, and what we're using. Caveat there, depending on the state that you're in, we can also contract with private dock owners to control vegetation in and around their dock if it's not being done by an entity and or it's not sufficient enough for what that homeowner's trying to do. That varies pretty widely state by state. Again, some states and some entities don't allow for the control of native species. Some states and some entities do allow for the control of native species. And again, it goes back to environment. Is a native species going to be a true detriment to the ability of a homeowner to get their boat in or out?
Right.
Does it become a health risk? Does it become a Anopheles mosquito risk? Not likely, but potential. So those are all factors that are looked at. And look, so Corps of Engineers, for example, if we're Old Hickory Lake in Tennessee, outside of Nashville, fully controlled by the Corps of Engineers, we cannot control native species without a specific reason. It has to be that a dock owner just can't get their boat out. We go and we say, "Hey, this is an issue." We send the map, we send the species, and then the Corps of Engineers has to sign off on that before we actually do the control. So that's how all of that kind of works in conjunction. So depending on where you're at, yes, dock owners do have the ability to have some relief if there's an issue.
Yeah, a lot of our reservoirs in Texas work the exact same way, where
Yeah.
we get a window that we can do applications. And our process, we do the exact same thing, Troy. We say what plant are we trying to target? They give us a distance around the dock and then a navigation lane back to main channel that we can apply in. We make a recommendation of what we're going to use, and then we have a 14-day public comment period associated with ours. And anybody in the state can sign up to be on that notification list. You get an email that says, Stevens Company is going to make an application at this dock on this day. If you have a comment, you can make it. And nobody really ever participates in that, but that's every state is different, as Troy said.
Yeah, luckily, most of the southeast that I work in doesn't have that public comment time frame, so it kind of makes me happy.
Yeah.
If I'll give you so in most parts of Alabama, if I need to go control vegetation, I can do it. If they called me tonight, I could be there at 7 in the morning. As long as now, listen. The other thing is every state has their own NPDES permit. That's a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. So we're actually, in terms of herbicide applications and our licensing, we're regulated by every state's Department of Agriculture. That's where our licensing comes from. But in terms of pesticides being applied and herbicides being applied to state waters, that falls under each individual state's Department of Environmental Management. In Tennessee, It's the Department of Environment and Conservation. And each of those states' environmental management entities has their own NPDES permit. They've been adopted for years now. We have to work, so we do have a permit that's utilized, but it's kind of a generic permit up to a certain number of acres. But we have to work within the parameters of that permit. We can't do things that are outside of that permit. We have to keep up with weather. We have to keep up with sunshine. We have to keep up with wind activity. We have to keep up with the herbicides we're spraying. And not only do we have to keep up with that for the state's environment management offices, but for the Department of Agriculture too. I mean, we're inspected annually by both entities, have to have your records, have to keep them all. And so it's not just like anybody can go spray something. If you're spraying public waters in any state, you have to be licensed with a certification for aquatic plant control, aquatic herbicides in each
Hmm.
state you're working in. So I don't want people to think that you can just hop on a boat and go do this. Everybody has to be certified and/or licensed to do this type of work on public water bodies.
Yeah, that's on my list of things to chat with you about. I'll get back to that because I want to make another point. In Texas, you can buy a harvester without a license and go harvest plants. You can't possess non-native plants, then it gets in this gray area. But they're for herbicide applicators, we're very regulated. For harvesters, there's almost no regulation, and that's
Nobody,
that's really
yeah,
scary.
nobody's regulated for putting down a benthic mat. I mean, and look, I mean, again, we're talking about if I were to pull up on a site, Stephen, and see Vallisneria americana, hydrilla, and milfoil growing, I'd be like, all right, we really want that americana to thrive. That's what the goal is here. I can specifically go in and remove the hydrilla and the milfoil with easily, and the Vallisneria is going to sit there and thrive. Are there cases where the Vallisneria maybe needs to be eliminated too? Possibly, but in these scenarios where we're talking about these authorities and these entities that want to leave native species, we have the ability, y'all, with fluoridone specifically, we can control milfoil as low as 2 parts per billion. That's per billion with a B. We can control hydrilla as low as 8 to 10 parts per billion. Most herbicides work in parts per million. So we're using rates that are 1,000 times less than some of these other products that are out there. So, and so that leaves every native species that's there. If it's the right environment with fluoridone, we can control milfoil and hydrilla easily and leave every native species that's present.
Yeah, one of the
Can't do
things
that
I
with
think.
you can't do that. No, you can't do that with a harvester, by the way.
No, you can't. No, you can't do that at all. And one of the things that always, we go to a lot of like aquatic plant management conferences. We have to get CE certifications every year, to where we're learning about either applications that have worked in the past and learning from our colleagues, or we're learning about regulation. We're making sure that we're collecting the right information. But one of the things that always sticks out to me is whenever they point out a part per billion, it would be like taking an eyedropper and diluting that down and then having a bathtub full of water and dropping one drop out of the eyedropper into the bathtub. That's about the equivalent.
Yeah, so this is how I'll get people to look at a million or a billion. A million seconds is 31 days. A billion seconds is 31 years. So that's the difference we're talking about. 31 days versus 31 years when we're talking about 1 part per million versus 1 part per billion. So, we're talking about minuscule rates, and it's just very effective, especially if you're talking about a polyculture of plants where you have exotic invasives and you need to leave the natives. We have the ability to do that at a very, very, very high level. And from an applicator standpoint, I'm not a herbicide manufacturer. What most people don't understand about herbicide manufacturing is it takes, on average, 10 years from development to the market. 10 years for herbicide manufacture because of all of the testing. It is going in our water supplies. The testing that has to be done is amazing. So it's a 10-year process, and the price tag on average is about 250 to $300 million. So when somebody's invested that type of money to get a product to market, it's kind of incumbent upon me as an applicator to figure out the best application technique, right? Um, we can take that, and so we try to develop new application techniques that actually allow us to even lessen the amount of herbicides by applying a product deeper in the water column. So we're not trying to affect the entire water column. We're putting it closer to the plant. Delivery systems are important. Drone technology is becoming important. Mapping is amazingly important. Matt Rail likes to say if you're not mapping, you're not managing. It's the only way to truly know how much biomass is there to control. So, those things are incumbent upon us as applicators and application companies to make sure we're following through with.
Yeah, it's the right message there, Troy. That's the right message. And that mapping technology is only getting better, to where, whenever I first started my career, it wasn't really available, and then quickly things like Biobase came available, and now you can buy a Lowrance. You can even buy a mobile Lowrance unit, and you can upload Biobase on your cell phone, so you can do it on the water and have a real topographic map that also has the vegetation density in real time, basically within the same day.
Yeah, and it's very inexpensive. I mean, it's a very, very good. It's a good program, and if people aren't using it, it's just I don't know. To me, it's a shame. And look, I didn't use it for a long time, so
Right.
shame on me.
Right.
I'll call a spade, and I'm the spade this time. So, um, yeah, but we use it. I mean, we use it daily,
Right.
daily. So,
This is what I'm talking about, Bailey. You've
Mm.
got a guy that really understands aquatic plant control, and if we all had Troy in our backyard, if he was spraying or working on the fisheries up north in New York for you guys, I think all the New York anglers would be ecstatic.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the biggest thing too is, like Troy, you've hit on multiple times is the importance is simply just coming on a podcast like this, the communication aspect where I think, a state like we talk about New York and we've had shows on this. Steve's been great in helping us communicate. I think it's there could just simply be a lack of communication. Like they could be doing the right thing, but the anglers don't know if they're gonna, sit and see things happen and there's no bridge to know like with each group. And I think we're getting to that point now in New York where there's going to be that communication of this is what's going on, this is why we're doing it, versus the anglers just throwing out angler theories type of deal. Where if it's if they're educated on why the agencies are doing what they're doing, that can help everything. You know what I'm saying? Where it's or allow the anglers to have education, like we're trying the purpose of this show, to try to say that the spraying grass is not in every case a bad thing. So it's uh, that was definitely something I've appreciated from this, and I hope a lot of anglers come away from the show. Isn't that was going to be one of my questions to you? Is if there is an angler that beyond the show they want to approach, their whether it's their state department or local fish and game, I guess I pitch that to you as well, Steve. Is how do they best try to communicate with their state agency to see what if I saw somebody spraying at my local lake, how do I go about asking why? Just from understanding. If that makes sense.
yeah. So, from my standpoint, it would be talking to who is the controlling authority for that reservoir, the true controlling authority. Is it the Corps of Engineers? Is it a New York power entity? Is it a New York power entity that you need to touch base with? Who's the controlling authority there? And reach out to their hotline. Just their most of these companies have a hotline you can reach out to and say, hey, I have an aquatic plant question, and they will direct you to the right people. Again, AERF is a great resource there. Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration Foundation. You can reach out to them, and they can certainly direct you in the right way. And look, um, y'all can post my information. I'm happy to help. However, we have an office in New York now. I'm going to be spending a little bit more time up there. But if there are public meetings, if there's forums, whatever, if there's stuff going on in those areas, look, I'll fly to it. I don't care. I mean, again, I mean, I like the conversation. And
Yeah.
I look, I did one years ago on the Chattanooga Fishing Forum, and I mean, it was way back in the day, and I was texting like I would have to pull off the road and eat, text. And it started very cordial and it ended horrifically. My dad almost fired me, like literally. He nearly fired me. He was like, Troy, I'm gonna have to let you go if you don't quit doing this. But look, again, I sometimes I hate to use the word education because I think people take offense to that sometimes, but I'm massively involved in how we educate the masses from homeowners to fishermen about what we do. Stephen does a great job of this. So look, again, we've made it far enough in our careers and we've seen enough and we've heard enough and we've talked to enough people that I think we know how to communicate this the right way
Mhm.
without it being so far. Look, I go into conversations sometimes with people that are, they just talk past you, they talk over you. And I'm like, look, you're gonna have to break that down to 5-year-old level for me because you're killing me. Um, I just like to have simple conversations about what's actually happening. And that's the only way I know how to understand it and break it
Mhm.
down for myself. And I think that Stephen does the same thing. And I think it's very effective in communications when we're trying to, just have a look. This is just a conversation. This isn't an argument. It's a
Mhm.
conversation about proper science and science of the day. And like I said earlier, while it is the science of the day, the science changes all the time. And so the CEU Stephen was talking about, continuing education points. We've got to stay abreast of all that so that we can continue to be hopefully effective communicators. And again, I don't expect to change everybody's mind, and there's a lot of people that'll be pissed off about it forever, but on both sides. But all I know to do is just continue to have the conversation.
Yeah, and I think speaking from anglers, I think there might be, like you said, there's always going to be somebody that you just say the word chemical or any of this kind of lingo we've been throwing out there, and they're going to be opposed to it, regardless of anything, any data or anything that you back up. Whether you're, they know you're right or wrong, they're going to be against it, like you said. But I think a lot of anglers, including myself, just like to know that there's somebody that knows that they do it well, like yourself at the helm. Like if, and especially if there's a line of communication and then there's maybe one angler that has like a seat at the table of a conversation of what's happening within the state, that we're good with it. I think that's the biggest thing. There's a lot of anglers like myself. I'll lead that charge of I don't know half the stuff you guys are talking about, and I'm not educated. And I won't try to say that I ain't even close to being educated to understand it. But if I know that there's folks like yourself that are in that role to protect our fisheries and make sure like there's reasons for what we're doing, what we're like, why we're doing that's all the anglers need, I think. And that's again, it comes back to why we're doing this show. It's just to try to help communicate that. And I think this is
Well,
great.
looking and in terms of resources, um, there are multiple academia institutions out there: Texas A&M, North Carolina State, University of Florida, Auburn, Mississippi State. I mean, wealth of knowledge. I mean, Jay Farrell at the University of Florida with IFAS. Then you've got, you know, um, Rob Richardson at NC State. You've got Gray Turnage at Mississippi State. You've got people like Steve Salmons in Fisheries at Auburn. And look, you can email and call those guys. Their numbers are on the websites. I mean, and they love it as much as we do, and they're willing to talk to you about it from an academia standpoint to understand the research that these large scale colleges are putting into these efforts to make sure what we're doing is safe, to make sure the most effective way to use the herbicides. I mean, we see presentation after presentation after presentation on this stuff that's all presented by students that are getting their master's degrees, PhD professors that are overseeing the research. It's a wealth of knowledge that people can tap into, and I think it's underutilized. I think from both sides, from our side too. I have people all the time saying, "Hey, I need to get some information." I'm like, "Have you checked out IFAS? Have you checked out Texas A&M?" They're like, "No, I didn't even know I could do that." And I'm like, "Man, you can start your plant identification course by yourself by going to A&M or Florida's websites right now." So, it's there's just a wealth of information out there that people can tap into that I think is not recognized, and getting that message out there, I think, is important for both sides. Again, it's just
Yeah.
massively important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the first steps to Bailey's question, if you want to get more educated, Troy's are identified. There is some sort of controlling authority. Go to their website, find their shoreline and habitat plan. It'll be a PDF on the website. So if it's Coosa River, you go to Alabama Power, you find their habitat and shoreline plan. And in that, it's going to describe both the native species and the non-native species that exist in the system. And it's going to give a directive as to what are they doing to control those species. And It will also give the contact information. There are people that is their sole job, is to think about and discuss those topics, and those are who you reach out to. And you, when you're able to, you reach out with an open mind and look for a positive conversation where you can both learn and grow from the conversation rather than start it with an argument. And for some reason, aquatic plant control has gotten to be one of those subjects that just seems like it starts with an argument every time, and it shouldn't. And then there's applicators like Troy uh, that do it right and understand how to do it right, and that's why we need Troy on the show. I mean, whenever I think about an aquatic plant and I need help with it, I call Troy. There's a reason, because he understands exactly what needs to be done.
Well, I appreciate that again. Too kind. But again, I'm probably the middleman. I'm probably asking somebody else behind closed doors. So
Good.
I may be calling pops. I'm like, Dad, I need some help here. So,
Yeah.
but no, it's one of those things I just got immersed in as a young man at 20, 22, 23 years old. And I had enough windshield time that I just ran scenarios through my head and had enough arguments internally and externally that I just realized arguing doesn't really do anything anymore. And there's a better approach, and it's a simple conversation. So,
Well, I would feel bad if we ended the conversation like this. I think there's a couple more cool things that you can teach us and show us. I definitely want to hear an airboat story, especially if you got one stuck somewhere. You always preach to me how I need an airboat because they're just invincible. So we got a good airboat story.
first of all, you're not a good airboat driver until you've sunk one. I've done that. My two worst airboat stories. I'll give them to you quickly. One, I was loaded with a tank, and I was coming out of a place called Polecat Holler on Gunnersville Lake. And it's a bridge with three sections. On either side you go under, you're clear. But there's a road bridge section, and on the opposite side there's a train bridge section. And the trestle, for some reason, in the center section, the trestle drops down. And that morning I picked the center section for some reason, and I'd been under it 1,000 times, and I decapitated the airboat. The bridge hit the cage hit the fan, it blew into about 1,000 pieces. And at the time, we only had two airboats, so I put the rope in my mouth like a dog, and I swam back around to the boat ramp and got it on the trailer, and I headed back to the office, and I was like, man, I know my dad's gonna fire me. I just knew it. I was like, I'm done. I almost just dropped the boat and kept going, but he didn't. So there's one. Then two, I'm not gonna say where it was because lawsuits could still be pending, but I was on a 6-lane highway. I was headed north at 70 miles an hour, and I was doing puddle jumping, just little ponds, and I had not strapped the back of the boat down, and the U-boat was the only thing holding it on the front. And it was rush hour, so I was in the far left lane, traffic everywhere, and I looked up, and the cable on the front had broken, and the cage just acted like a wind catch, and it pulled the airboat off of the trailer, and it started sliding across traffic to the right at 70 miles an hour. I just looked up, and it was nearly catching me. It slid all the way across 3 lanes of traffic. It stopped perfectly parallel on the shoulder next to a concrete wall. And I was like, I couldn't have parked it better. 5 cars behind me all rear ended each other. Bam, 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 bam. My boat didn't hit anybody. Nobody hit my boat. I didn't hit anybody. The cops got there and they were like, hey, how quick can you get the boat on the trailer? I said, if you let me turn it on real fast. I said, but I'm going to blow dust everywhere. He said, well, let's not do that. So Wrecker's coming in the meantime. I called Dad. I'm like, Dad, we're gonna there's gonna be a lawsuit. We're gonna get sued. He's like, well, just do whatever you got to do. So I get on, and they write me a ticket for an unsecured load. That's the only ticket I got, was an unsecured load. Every person that rear-ended the person in front of them got cited for following too close. So that's the only thing that happened.
That
But
story
those are
could only
my
happen in
those,
Alabama.
that was actually in Georgia, but
Oh.
yeah. I'm not going to tell you specifically where, but yeah, that's been a long time ago. I think the statute of limitations on the lawsuit's probably run out, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those slow motion moments when you see your airboat leave the trailer and nearly catch you coming down the highway. I was like, man, lawsuits are pending. So it was bad.
Oh, man.
All right, I got a couple more. Tell me who's a better angler, Bill Dance or Kevin Van Dam? You
What are
fish
you
with them
doing?
both. You fish with them both. Tell me
I've never
who you
fished.
enjoyed.
I've never fished with either one of them.
Yep.
Luke Bryan's the better of the three.
Oh, there we go.
no, no, listen, generationally, I mean, obviously I've had the privilege of knowing Bill and Kevin, and it's hard to say, man. I mean, they're both amazing. I've known Bill now for 31 years, since I was 17. That's a good story. The very first time we did work for Bill was treating spatter dock in West Tennessee, and my dad and my brother went over to do the work, and they had put Vaseline on the running boards of the airboat, and they backed off this ramp. It slid off the boat, off the trailer, stood straight up in the water, and it sunk straight to the bottom. The very first time he met Bill, and Bill was like, "Terry, if I'd known you were going to sink an airboat, I'd have had a camera here." So, yeah, we sunk an airboat the first time we worked with Bill. Bill's an unbelievable angler. As a kid, you watch somebody and you just like, yeah, I'm going. That's how next time I'm fishing, that's what I'm going to do. But Kevin's provided the same thing. I think generationally, we've had the privilege of watching two of the greatest of all time, but there are kids today that maybe Kevin is the first person they saw in a tournament. So that's been unique. But getting to work with those two guys, um, I mean, what do you say? I mean, it's a privilege of a lifetime.
Isn't it? Yeah. And Kevin
Pretty
doesn't say anything bad about you. So you've impressed the GOAT, which means we probably should have just opened with that so that everybody knew they could trust you.
Just
Well,
Kevin opening for it.
they they still might not trust me, but look, Kevin's a great guy. He comes and fishes. He actually did a show.
Mm-hmm.
His third episode was with Luke on his new fishing show, and that's one of the lakes that I managed for Luke. So it was a good day on the water.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive. Pretty impressive.
Losing some fish right now. Too much cold weather for Florida strain fish, but we'll fix it.
It happens.
It happens.
It makes rooms for the next generation. All right, so MLF is going to Guntersville for Red Crest this year. So definitely hope I get to spend time with you there. But can you give us like a current, what is happening at Guntersville? What do I need to know about it? Give me the inside.
Hey, right. I can't. I don't fish it. I haven't
Maybe on
fished
a grass
Guntersville since
standpoint, like what's happening with the eelgrass? It has Rockstar
Eelgrass is
now.
good. It does have Rockstar. They don't like to call it that. It's actually Eurasian eelgrass is what they're calling it. Rockstar, I think, is too nice of a connotation for that stuff. It's a nightmare. Um, it's very low in the water column. You'll find some floating mats right now, but the eelgrass, if it's there, it's present in very short form fashion. It's 4 or 5 inches long, very
Mhm.
patchy, not like what it'll be in the spring. We are starting to see that eelgrass is starting to taper back some, and hydrilla and milfoil in some areas is starting to reestablish pretty well. So it may be a different dynamic this spring. When are y'all coming? March, April?
April, yeah.
Yeah. So by that point in time, there should be some pretty good vegetative mats that are low in the water column, which will still provide pretty good fishing. They're not topped out. They're certainly not matted out to the point that it's going to be a detriment to the fishery. So the hydrilla in April will be pretty low in the water column, and so will the eelgrass. So it ought to provide a pretty good bite in some of those shallow water shelves, I would think.
Yeah, it might actually be the end of March, but travel so many tournaments, it gets tough to remember them all.
I think it's the first week of
Yeah.
April.
Yeah, it's in that window.
Yeah, actually it is.
Yeah,
I
I'll be.
only know that because I can't go to Red Crest this year because it's my wife's birthday.
Gotcha.
Yeah. That's first week of April.
Where are y'all? So which boat ramp are y'all using?
Oh yeah, I don't even know the date, so for sure I know the boat ramp. Come on, Troy, you know me
Well,
better than that.
I'll be there. We'll do dinner for sure. I'll be there at least one night. So
Yeah, I'll have room for you at the expo and all those things. Anytime I can spend time with
where
you is a good time.
where's the
Don't
expo
ask.
going to be?
Don't ask.
Oh my goodness.
Hey,
Is
you
it
know what,
Birmingham?
Bailey? Anybody who's interested can go into the show description. Bailey's going to have a link to Red Crest at Guntersville. How about that?
I'm fairly positive it's in Birmingham. No, is it? Okay, now I'm
It's in-
second guessing
no,
myself. I don't know if
Birmingham was
Huntsville
last
is in
year,
Birmingham
wasn't
or
it?
Birmingham and Huntsville.
I don't know.
Typically, the weigh-ins are in Birmingham.
There you
Well,
go.
you're
We
not
don't do
doing
weigh-ins.
weigh-ins though.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah,
We
it's all
weigh
on the
every
water.
fish on
So
the water. Yeah, but
Huntsville
we will
has
have a
look.
big expo.
Huntsville would be awesome. I guess you could do it at the Von Braun Civic Center in Huntsville, but I don't know. Good.
We'll learn.
You know who just tried to call me?
Kevin.
It, no, Matt Rail, and he's
Uh,
going to be so mad at me because we're struggling to do our podcast right now because we're so busy, and
well,
I've
yeah.
blocked
Promote
out.
y'all's podcast. Promote yours and Matt's podcast. That'd be great.
Yeah, well, we don't have to do that, but it is sitting dockside if anybody's interested. So,
Yeah, dude, we'll put links and everything to it in the description. Feel free to.
Sitting
uh,
dockside, you can hear me talk about all kinds of things. I think I've
yep,
been a guest several times. I can't remember how many. But you can
I
also
think 3 or 4
hear
now.
you can hear Troy and Matt. They do an excellent job. Matt is one of mine and Troy's good buddies. Uh, Originally from Indiana, spent some time in Florida, back to Indiana now, and yeah, he's probably calling you right now, Troy, because there's nothing for him to do up there.
Look, those guys up there. I mean, what do you look? You can't you can't deal with them people up north. Sorry, Bailey. I
Hey,
mean,
I can't deal with this either.
for an aquatics manager, the north this time of year is like being in Siberia, man. There ain't nothing to do. You can't do nothing with fish. You can do some ice fishing, but man, down here we just never stop. That's why we're so much tougher than people like Matt because we work all the time.
That's right. That's right. So it's sitting dockside. Also, part of sitting dockside, you guys have the social media, the Facebook group. What's the Facebook group called?
Lake and pond management questions, content, and community.
Yeah, it's a big
Yeah,
one.
Yeah, I'm gonna
For our
yeah, it's a
little
big one.
for our niche industry, it is a big one. And
Yeah, and
if
there's another group out there. I can't think of the name of it, but I think we've got maybe 60,000 folks on that Facebook page now. So,
yeah,
Dang.
yeah, too many
yeah,
questions to answer on a day-to-day basis.
if it gets late at night and you just need a laugh, you can also just go into the comment section and you'll see Troy comment, and then people argue with him for the next 30 minutes, and that always just makes me giggle.
It doesn't make me giggle. It gets my blood pressure up, which I'm trying to fix these days. But yeah, look, I don't I don't claim to know everything, but I do know most things. So
All right, let me see. Let me check my list here. How many black helicopters does your company own?
that's zero. And we don't spray at night. If you see an airboat at night with a bunch of lights, it's a bow fisherman. It is not us. Um, there's not enough money in this work to have black helicopters for spraying or to be out at night spraying. That's just not the case. I
I,
promise.
I
Cross
think
my heart.
Troy, I think that's it. We've hit every myth.
Scouts honor.
We've hit every myth. You debunked them all. What did we miss, buddy? Is there anything we missed?
I don't think so. I really just look. I love the opportunity. I truly appreciate it. Thank you for the kind words. Too kind, actually. I'm not that good of a person, and again, carrying this conversation on is important. Bailey, if I can help in New York or anywhere, I mean, I know there's a lot of work going on in the Connecticut River with the hydrilla project up there now.
Mhm.
So anytime I can be a part of a Zoom conversation, an in-person conversation, a forum, a meeting, man, don't hesitate. Happy to hop a flight and get up there and try to at least spread the good word as I know it, and maybe help calm some fears and some misinformation out there.
Yeah, man, I might take you up on that. That might be great because we have some anglers that are working hard just to get a seat at the table and stuff up here, and things are definitely much better now. I would say situation wise than a couple years back, and a lot of that thanks to Steve and his guidance. And we'll love to definitely have you or in the conversation. So if you're cool, I definitely would love to pass along your contact. And man, if you come up this way, holler at me. We'll take you to the juice holes and go catch some fish while you're up this way.
I love it. It sounds like a plan to me.
All right.
Well, and I just appreciate you coming on here, taking the hard topic, hard question head on. The only way I know Troy to do it. And I think this is going to be excellent. People are going to learn from this episode. And it's not the last one. I've already got Troy booked on another episode. We're going to reverse this conversation in the next episode. And we're going to talk about our favorite plants and why they are our favorite plants, and try to situationally discuss how we can grow plants and take advantage of them.
Yeah, that'll be excellent. I'm looking forward to that. I've studied that list a little bit already. I'm going to dive into it more on my flight tomorrow, so that'll be good.
Yeah, it'll be good. Really good. And then I guess the last thing, Troy, just to embarrass you a little bit more, do we have any new albums coming out? Do you have like the Spraying Me in Blues, or what do we got?
No, no, buddy. That's history, ancient history. That's old stuff, man. That's my son's deal now. He's wanting to be a songwriter. So when I was a young man, I thought I was going to be a country music artist, and I think my niche is aquatic plants and fish. So I think I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Well,
Well,
if I
nowadays
had
you got to make a rap album, and then you'll win country music.
Exactly. You know what? It's a thought. I may try that. I don't know if I've got the dance moves to pull off a rap album, buddy. I mean,
you definitely have the tight jeans, though.
oh my goodness, that's not true either. They're looser now. I'm down 15 pounds. Working on that.
Congratulations,
Working on
man.
that. So
Yeah,
mhm.
love that. Love that.
Yeah.
Well, if I had the album, I would play you an outro from your own album, but I don't have the album.
I'll send you one. I've got about I made 1,000, and I think I have 960 left. So there's a lot.
Well, maybe you need to give those away at AERF meetings or something.
That's an idea. Maybe at my next booth. Maybe when I go to Southern Division. Are you going to Southern Division AFS?
I am not. I'm sorry. I'm not. Yep.
I may set them at my booth at Southern Division AFS next week. So,
Sign them.
little,
I want a signed
little,
copy.
you know, you can't even. My signature looks like signatures, chicken scratch.
I want it personalized.
Well, to Stephen, and that's all it'll say.
That's great. I would love it. Troy, thank you so much, brother. Really appreciate you being on the show. Can't wait for the next episode. The audience is going to eat this up, or they're going to kick us off the internet.
So.
One of the things.
All right, folks, and there you have it. Steve, that was another great one there. Thanks to Troy again, as we mentioned, taking time out to drop a lot of knowledge on us. And like I said at the beginning, it's eye-opening for me, especially to look at some of the stuff and the importance of it and the actual impacts, not the doomsday angler theory that I like to kid about, but is really true, because we like to have these big pictures in our head that things can damage much more than we realize, where a lot of it could just simply be Mother Nature. But he put into great perspective on how all this stuff actually works, and the spraying and the direction, the things that they put into the equation before they actually click go,
Right.
So it was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah, his thought process on how he puts together an application, all the details of who controls the lake or water body and makes those decisions, and how a company like Troy's is put in place to do control methods, and the licenses they have to have, and the continuing education and the record keeping they have, and just all the details of it. I think that's so important to know. And then you get to hear some fun stories from Troy as well. He's a really cool guy. It's not all science with him. That makes him fun to talk to.
Yeah, definitely is going to make for some more fun conversations here in the future, getting him back on some shows. And that is one that where I'm sure there's going to be comments and questions that came from that conversation, but definitely want to challenge the people, if they're still watching, listening to this right now, is get in the comments, get in the DMs, send us emails, and make sure you guys follow along with Troy and their socials, as well as with his podcast that we'll link down the show notes. But reach out to us. Like, if you have questions and things that you're curious about from the conversation from today, get those into us, not just for lake hotlines coming up on future shows, but also just this, like we said, we're just going to have Troy back here for multiple shows. And these are questions that we can bring up into this, provide clarity for you guys, and myself included, to be honest. Very obviously a novice when it comes to this conversation. So challenging the folks that are tuning into the show to participate and ask some questions if you guys have any that came from today's conversation.
Love it. Love it, Bailey. Love it.
Heck yeah, man. Well, it was a great show. Thanks again to Troy for taking out the time. Like I said, is all of his links to the groups and places where you guys can learn more about what he's doing, and obviously listen to his podcast are all linked in the show notes for you guys on YouTube and for podcasts. But man, should we get into today's segment of the Lake Hotline?
Yeah, we got a question. Let's answer a question. Once again, like you said, we love them in the comments. You can DM us, email us. These questions are all about answering whatever hot topic you have about your specific lake or project you're working on, or just a
Yeah.
fishing question, all of it. We're excited
Whether
about
you're
it. So what is this week's?
Oregon, Florida, Maine, doesn't matter. Submit your question.
Yeah.
We'll get
Yeah.
an answer. So this is a good one because I think it's one that we talked about with Shane, and it's one
Okay.
that I think is obviously going to be a topic upcoming for a long time, and especially on some of the shows we're going to do. And that is from Kyle Hancock, asking about the Alabama bass, and he's asking, do you think the Alabama bass takeover is caused directly by humans or from just simply a natural takeover?
Okay. Yeah. So basically, if we go back 20 years ago, we didn't know that Alabama bass were different species than spotted bass. They look fairly similar. We have to do genetic testing to actually identify which species it is. And so you can take some examples like California. All of the spotted bass that are in California are Alabama bass. We know that. So that introduction is human induced. We know that for a fact. They fed on trout in California and they got to an extreme size, which created some popularity of those fish. And we can trace specific tournaments and people traveling out of state and then back. We can actually trace those to some of the introductions, like in Lake Norman. And the agency actually has timelines of when those events happened out of state and when the Alabama bass were first seen in the reservoirs, and they match up. So we do have factual evidence of those introductions. And what is interesting about DNA is you can start to track family lineage. So you can actually tell if a fish is a cousin, a half sibling, a sibling, a parent of another fish. So we can start now tracking where does this population in X state originate from? And it is not typically watershed bound. Now, after they've been introduced into a watershed, then they make their way up or down a watershed. So once they've been introduced somewhere in the system, then it becomes a population that becomes invasive and jumps from reservoir to reservoir. So initially, we know that they start human-based travel, and then as soon as they get into a water body, then they spread from there. And Alabama bass can hybridize with spotted bass, smallmouth bass, and largemouth. So they don't even have to hybrid, or they don't even have to travel as pure species. They can hybridize and they can move that way, so they can get their genetic material into a new body of water that way. They did evolve in a river drainage by themselves, without spotted bass, smallmouth bass, or largemouth being present. And so they did not have to create a reproductive niche in the same way that those other three species did that had some overlap in their evolution. And so, if we look far enough back, they were able to freely spawn over a larger spawning window and use different types of habitats. And therefore, when they get introduced into systems outside of their native range, they're able to continue to spawn. And that's why they can then hybridize with those other black bass species, is because they have that broad reproductive range rather than a very specific spawning niche. So it is something that you definitely want to be aware of. Whenever people talk about Alabama bass introductions and you see your states talking about removing Alabama bass, that is something that we need help with. So that's a great question. Really appreciate it. Good lake hotline this week.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be becoming a louder and louder conversation. Obviously, pertaining to more of a specific region of the country, but still one that I think that is obviously it's a major hotbed of especially the bass fishing community. But seems that to be that conversation is more and more folks are talking about it and the dangers of what's happening.
Well, enough time has happened in enough places that we now can see a pattern. Spotted bass are introduced. You see individuals exceed 4 to 5 pounds. You see some of those individuals even getting 8 or 9 pounds. And after that first or second generation, then we see a dramatic decline across the fishery and the growth of all black bass species. And then we see smallmouth being pretty much eradicated within that first 10-year timeline. And then over a 20-year time, spotted bass, largemouth bass both become really limited. The majority of the population becomes Alabama bass. They stunt, they don't grow well, and now we're stuck with a lot of 10 to 14-inch fish or smaller, and there's no way out of that system once it happens. It's a really tough management once they've been introduced and they've been able to establish that long.
And it's kind of crazy that it's basically one person that takes a live well full of Alabama spots can basically almost destroy a whole fishery.
Some of the stories I've heard, from biologists across different states, is they've actually found record of tournament directors bringing the whole live release trailer back full of fish, and they know that it's happened. And whenever they're recording that they're doing these things, that's pretty blatant, and that ruins a fishery for everybody. And it's because of, we did see the popularity of the Alabama bass introduction in California, and we saw a world record getting broke. And without the understanding of what was happening in that specific system and why it was successful, that's really detrimental to spread across the country and think that we can replicate that, where now, in fact, we know that we can't replicate that. And we have a system that doesn't work once they're introduced, and we're seeing that time and time again. So we know that the spread of Alabama bass is a really bad thing.
Yeah, it's like you said, Great Lake Hotline this week, and is going to be a topic, I think, a conversation for unfortunately a long time, but especially I'm sure we'll bring you having some shows on it here in the future.
I've got some biologists planned to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'd assume it's probably going to be brought up in Black Bass 2025 this summer, right?
It definitely will. Yeah, we'll definitely have, whenever we talk about how to future-proof bass management, how to make sure that black bass fisheries exist in another 25 years, this is one of the things we have to think about, is how do we stop anglers from transporting Alabama bass?
Awesome. We're looking forward to that. But Steve, anything else folks need to know on today's show before we wrap up?
Another great episode. I hope that people made it this far into the episode. If you did, that means that you heard everything Troy had to say and the discussion that Bailey and I had with him. Hopefully you're going to leave me some great comments, some questions for Troy, because he will be back on future episodes. And we've got one that we're planning already in a couple months. Can't wait to talk about, aquatic plants and how they can be beneficial to systems and what makes them beneficial. That's going to be a fun take on it. So just look forward to more episodes. We're enjoying it. So hopefully we're going to stay on the internet. People are going to love this, and can't wait to do the next episode, Bailey.
Heck yeah. Well, folks, appreciate all of you guys for tuning in. As always, we'll see you on the next one.